Emanuela Orlandi. She left her home and never came back. A 15-year-old Vatican citizen vanished after her flute lesson in Rome in 1983, and what followed was a 40-year mystery involving popes, mobsters, international terrorists, banking scandals, and secrets the Catholic Church may never reveal. Before we dive in, leave a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow, we've got another mind-blowing story for you. Rome, June 22nd, 1983. The temperature climbed past 36 degrees Celsius that Wednesday afternoon, one of those suffocating Roman summers where the heat seems to press down from the sky like a physical weight. The air shimmered above the cobblestones. Tourists sought refuge in the shade of Baroque fountains. Even the pigeons in Piazza Navona looked exhausted, barely bothering to scatter when children chased them across the ancient pavement. In the smallest country on earth, behind the towering colonnade of St. Peter's Square, a 15-year-old girl was getting ready for her flute lesson. Her name was Emanuela Orlandi, and she lived in a place most people only ever see as tourists. Not in Rome, technically, but inside it, behind the ancient walls of Vatican City, in a small apartment where her family had resided for generations, where the Pope was your neighbor, where Swiss guards in Renaissance-era uniforms stood watch at every gate, where the manicured gardens and marble statues had been her playground since childhood. She was running late. The heat was oppressive, the kind of heat that makes you want to stay inside with the shutters closed. She asked her older brother Pietro if he would drive her to music school. It wasn't far, just a mile or so through the winding streets of Rome's historic center. But in this heat, even that seemed too much. He refused. He was 20 years old and had other things to do. Plans that seemed important at the time, but that he would never remember later, they argued. The kind of argument siblings have every day in every country in the world. Words exchanged in frustration. A door slammed on the way out. Pietro would replay that moment in his mind for the next 4 decades. The sound of the door, the echo in the hallway, his sister's footsteps fading down the corridor, the silence that followed, a silence that would stretch into weeks, then months, then years, then decades. He never saw her again. The door slammed at approximately 4 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon. By midnight, the Orlandi family would be desperately searching the streets of Rome. By the next morning, police would be involved. Within weeks, Pope John Paul II himself would appeal for her return. And within months, the case would become entangled with international terrorism, organized crime, Vatican banking scandals, and secrets that would take 40 years to begin unraveling. What happened to Emanuela Orlandi after she left that apartment has become Italy's most famous unsolved mystery. A case that has implicated popes and mobsters, terrorists and bankers, secret services and serial killers. A disappearance that would expose the darkest secrets of the Catholic Church and the criminal underworld that operated in its shadow. For over 40 years, her family has demanded answers. The Vatican has remained silent, and somewhere in the space between those ancient walls and the truth, Emanuela Orlandi vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions that refuse to die. This is her story. To understand what happened to Emanuela Orlandi, you first have to understand where she came from. Because this wasn't just any missing teenager. She was a citizen of the world's smallest sovereign state, a place with fewer than 800 residents, where everyone knew everyone, where the Pope was your neighbor, and where the gardens behind St. Peter's Basilica were your childhood playground. Vatican City, just 0.49 square kilometers, smaller than Disneyland Paris by a factor of nearly 40. A country so tiny you can walk across it in 15 minutes, yet one that commands the spiritual allegiance of over 1 billion people worldwide. A place where Renaissance masters painted the ceilings and Michelangelo sculpted the doorways. Where every cobblestone has been walked by saints and sinners, pilgrims and popes for nearly 2,000 years. This was Emanuela's home. She was born on January 14, 1968, the fourth of 5 children born to Ercole and Maria Orlandi. The family name appeared in Vatican records going back generations. Theirs was a lineage of service to the Holy See, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust. Ercole worked as an invoice in the prefecture of the pontifical household, essentially a messenger and administrator for the papal residence. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it came with something rare and precious: Vatican citizenship. Among the tiny population of the world's smallest country, the Orlandis held a privileged place. They were among the handful of lay families granted the right to live within the walls, to call this extraordinary place home. Their apartment was modest by most standards, cramped quarters for a family of 7, but the view from their windows took in the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, and their backyard was the most famous garden in Christendom. The Orlandi children, Pietro, Natalina, Federica, Maria Cristina, and Emanuela, grew up in circumstances unlike any other in the world. They played among Renaissance statues and manicured hedges. They learned to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the Apostolic Palace. They crossed paths with cardinals and dignitaries, priests and pilgrims. The Vatican gardens were available to us as if it was our own back garden, Pietro would later recall. We felt we were in the safest place in the world. Safe. The word echoes through the years with tragic irony. They're our family. Photographs showing the Orlandi children with Pope John Paul II, the beloved Polish pontiff, who had ascended to the throne of St. Peter in October 1978. The same pope who had survived an assassination attempt in May 1981, when a Turkish gunman named Mehmet Ali Aka shot him twice in St. Peter's Square. The same pope who would, within weeks of Emanuela's disappearance, become personally involved in her case, and whose involvement would only deepen the mystery. Emanuela herself was described as lively and cheerful, a girl with dark hair and bright eyes, who radiated warmth and energy. Nothing seemed to diminish her spirit. She was the kind of teenager who made friends easily, who laughed often, who threw herself into her passions with complete dedication. And chief among those passions was music. Emanuela played the flute with genuine talent, spending hours practicing her scales and studying new pieces. She also played piano and sang in the choir at the Church of Sant'Anna dei Palafrenieri, one of the oldest parishes in the Vatican, where the Swiss Guards traditionally worshipped. Her voice was said to be sweet and clear, the voice of a girl who found joy in the sacred music that echoed through the ancient stone walls. Even though she'd finished her second year of secondary school at a scientific high school in Rome, the summer holiday hadn't interrupted her musical studies. She continued taking flute lessons 3 times a week at the Scuola di Musica Tommaso Ludovico da Vittoria, a prestigious music school connected to the Pontifical Institute of Sacred Music. The school took its name from the great Spanish Renaissance composer, and it trained students in the highest traditions of sacred music. The school was located in Piazza di Sant'Apollinare, just steps from Piazza Navona, one of Rome's most beloved squares, with its Baroque fountains and cafes and street artists. To get there from the Vatican, Emanuela would take a city bus, riding through the narrow streets of the historic center, past ancient churches and Renaissance palaces. She would get off a few stops before her destination and walk the remaining distance through Rome's Centro Storico, past shops and trattorias, and the endless parade of tourists that defined summer in the Eternal City. It was a routine she had followed countless times before, a routine that felt as safe as the Vatican gardens themselves. June the 22nd, 1983, should have been no different. That Wednesday afternoon, Emanuela left her apartment around 4 p.m., dressed for the heat in light clothes. She was late for her 5 p.m. lesson, and the sweltering temperature made her ask Pietro for a ride. When he refused, an argument ensued, the kind of trivial disagreement between siblings that happens every day in every family across the world. Meaningless, forgotten within hours. Except this one would haunt Pietro for the rest of his life. "It's a very painful memory," he would say decades later. "She insisted I take her, and we rode over it. Then she left, slamming the door. I never thought it would be the last time I saw her. I've gone over it so many times, telling myself, if only I had accompanied her, maybe it wouldn't have happened." Emanuela made it to her flute lesson. That much is certain. But something happened along the way. Something strange enough that she felt compelled to call home. Around 7 p.m. after the lesson ended, Emanuela phoned her sister from a public telephone near the school. What she told her sister would become the first piece of a puzzle that has never been solved. A man had approached her. He was well-dressed, driving a green BMW. He'd offered her a job, distributing flyers for Avon Cosmetics at some kind of fashion show. The pay would be generous, the equivalent of 500 euros for just a few hours of work. Her sister advised her to come home and discuss it with their parents before making any decisions. Emanuela agreed. But she never came home. At the bus stop in Piazza di Sant'Apollinare, Emanuela was seen waiting with two friends after her lesson ended. The Basilica di Sant'Apollinare loomed behind them, its imposing facade a reminder of the church's presence in every corner of Roman life. The June evening was still bright, the sun not yet setting, but the heat was finally beginning to relent. Emanuela told her friends about the strange job offer, the well-dressed man in the green BMW, the promise of easy money, distributing cosmetics flyers. One friend later testified that Emanuela had seemed intrigued but uncertain. The offer was flattering. 500 euros for a few hours' work. It seemed too good to be true. Perhaps because it was. They waited together for a while, watching for the bus. Then one friend left to catch a different route home. Another girl, someone who has never been identified, despite decades of investigation, remained with Emanuela at the stop. The buses came and went. The shadows lengthened across the piazza. And then Emanuela was gone. A witness, one of many whose testimony would prove frustratingly incomplete, later reported seeing a girl, matching her description, getting into a green BMW near the music school. The car was described as an expensive model, unusual in that neighborhood. The driver was a man, well-dressed, middle-aged. The witness couldn't provide more details. She had glanced over, then looked away. It hadn't seemed important at the time. Another witness claimed to have seen Emanuela on a city bus, talking animatedly to a red-haired woman. This woman, too, was never identified. She became one of the case's many phantoms, a figure glimpsed briefly, then lost forever in the crowd. Two different witnesses, two different stories, both claiming to have seen Emanuela, neither able to say definitively what happened next. By 9:30 that evening, the Orlandi family was worried. Emanuela was always punctual, always reliable. She wasn't the type to stay out late without calling. She wasn't the type to break routine. This wasn't like her. They began searching, first the neighborhood around their Vatican apartment, then expanding outward through the streets of central Rome. Pietro joined the search, riding his Vespa through the cobblestone streets, calling his sister's name. Their mother went to the music school. Their father contacted Vatican security. Nothing. The Roman night closed in around them, hot and still. The great dome of St. Peter's glowed against the sky, and somewhere in the ancient city, their 15-year-old daughter had vanished without a trace. The next morning, with still no sign of their daughter, the Orlandis went to the police. It was now 18 hours since Emanuela had left for her flute lesson, and 18 hours of silence, 18 hours of growing dread. The police response was, in retrospect, tragically inadequate. Italian law in 1983 did not require immediate action for missing persons cases. The assumption, built into the system, embedded in police culture, was that teenagers who didn't come home had probably run away. They were probably with a boyfriend. They were probably rebelling against their parents. Give it time. These things usually resolve themselves. The Orlandis pushed back. Their daughter wasn't a runaway. She didn't have a secret boyfriend. She didn't rebel. She was a good Catholic girl who lived inside the Vatican for God's sake. Something had happened to her. The police took their statement. They promised to look into it. But there was no urgency, no sense of alarm. No search parties were organized. No alerts were issued. No photographs were circulated. Desperate, the Orlandis took matters into their own hands. They published Emanuela's photograph in the newspaper, along with their home telephone number, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The photograph showed a pretty girl with dark hair and a bright smile, the kind of face that made you want to help. The kind of face that made you think this could be anyone's daughter. The response was overwhelming and bewildering. Calls began pouring into the Orlandi apartment at all hours of the day and night. Some were cruel hoaxes, people claiming to have seen Emanuela in places she couldn't have been, or pretending to be her kidnappers just to torment the family. Some were well-meaning but mistaken, confusing Emanuela with other young women spotted around Rome. Some were simply confused, the callers uncertain what they had seen or why they were calling. But among the noise, there were other calls. Calls that seemed different. Calls from people who claimed to know exactly where Emanuela was and exactly what had happened to her. These callers would prove to be something else entirely. On July 3, 1983, Pope John Paul II addressed the crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square for his weekly Sunday Angelus. What he said shocked the world. "I am close to the Orlandi family in their anguish," the Pope declared, making an unprecedented public appeal for the return of a single missing teenager. "I share their anxiety and hope that Emanuela may be restored to the embrace of her family as soon as possible." It was extraordinary. The Supreme Pontiff, leader of more than 1 billion Catholics worldwide, was personally intervening in what should have been a local police matter. But the Pope's involvement was about to make the case exponentially more complicated. 2 days after the papal appeal, the Orlandi family received a telephone call that would change everything. The caller spoke Italian with a foreign accent. He would later be referred to as the American because of his distinctive way of speaking. He claimed to represent an organization that had kidnapped Emanuela. Their demand was simple. They wanted Mehmet Ali Aka, the Turkish terrorist who had shot Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square 2 years earlier, to be released from prison. If Aka was not freed, the caller warned, Emanuela would be killed. To understand this demand, you have to understand what had happened on May 13, 1981, the day a young gunman nearly assassinated the leader of the Catholic Church. It was a Wednesday afternoon, just like the day Emanuela would disappear 2 years later. Thousands of pilgrims had gathered in St. Peter's Square for the Pope's weekly general audience. John Paul II was riding slowly through the crowd in his open vehicle, the white Fiat Campagnola that would later be replaced by the bulletproof Pope Mobile, blessing the faithful, reaching out to touch outstretched hands. At approximately 5:19 p.m., as the vehicle stopped near the bronze door, shots rang out across the square. Mehmet Ali Aka was 23 years old when he pulled the trigger. Born in the Turkish province of Malatya, he had grown up in poverty before becoming involved with the Grey Wolves, Bozkurtlar in Turkish, a far-right ultranationalist organization with a history of political violence. He was already wanted for murder. In 1979, he had assassinated Abdi İpekçi, a prominent left-wing newspaper editor in Istanbul. After escaping from a Turkish military prison, reportedly with help from the Grey Wolves' second-in-command, Abdullah Çatlı, Aka had made his way across Europe using false passports. He had threatened the Pope publicly in a letter left in his prison cell, calling John Paul II the masked leader of the Crusades, and vowing to kill him during his planned visit to Turkey. Now, in St. Peter's Square, he made good on that threat. 2 bullets struck the Pope. One lodged in his lower intestine, the other hit his left hand. 2 bystanders were also wounded in the spray of gunfire. Aka attempted to flee, but was grabbed by bystanders and Vatican security, preventing his escape and possibly preventing further shots. John Paul II slumped into the arms of his secretary, blood spreading across his white cassock. He was rushed to the Gemelli Hospital, where he underwent 5 hours of emergency surgery. He lost nearly 3/4 of his blood. Twice, his heart stopped on the operating table. He survived. He would later attribute his survival to the Virgin Mary, noting that the assassination attempt had occurred on the anniversary of the apparitions at Fatima. The so-called Third Secret of Fatima, revealed years later, was interpreted by the Vatican as a prophecy of the attack. But the question of who had sent Aka and why would never be definitively answered. At his trial, Aka claimed to be acting alone. Then he implicated Bulgarian intelligence services, suggesting the KGB had orchestrated the attack through their Eastern Bloc proxies. At the 1985 trial of alleged co-conspirators, Aka undermined his own testimony by claiming to be Jesus Christ and predicting the imminent apocalypse. The Bulgarian connection was investigated extensively, but never proven. Some believed the Soviets had wanted to eliminate a pope who was supporting the Solidarity movement in his native Poland. Others thought Aka was a pawn of Turkish nationalist politics. Still others suspected Western intelligence agencies of manufacturing the Bulgarian angle to embarrass the USSR. What was clear was that Aka was serving a life sentence in Italy's Rebibbia prison, sentenced on July 22, 1981, just 2 months after the shooting. In December 1983, Pope John Paul II would visit him in his cell to personally offer forgiveness, an act of Christian mercy that captivated the world. And now, in the summer of 1983, someone claiming to have kidnapped a Vatican teenager was demanding Aka's release. The Pope's would-be assassin had become leverage in whatever game was being played with Emanuela Orlandi's life. The calls continued throughout the summer of 1983. The American contacted both the Orlandi family and the Vatican, playing recordings of what he claimed was Emanuela's voice. Italian Secret Services installed recording equipment in the Orlandi apartment. A lawyer named Gennaro Egidio, experienced in terrorism and international affairs, was appointed to handle negotiations. Then in August, a new group emerged. They called themselves the Turkish Anti-Christian Turkesh Liberation Front. Turkesh for short. In written communiques sent to Italian news agencies, they claimed responsibility for kidnapping Emanuela and demanded Acca's release. Over the next 2 years, they would send 7 letters in total. What made the Turkesh claims particularly disturbing was their specificity. They knew details about Emanuela's private life that hadn't been publicly reported, things like the number of moles on her back. This wasn't random speculation. Someone had either met Emanuela or had access to extremely personal information about her. And then Turkesh made another claim. They also had Mirella Gregori. Mirella Gregori was another 15-year-old Roman girl who had vanished 40 days before Emanuela Orlandi on May 7, 1983. The circumstances were eerily similar, yet also distinctly different. Mirella had no connection to the Vatican whatsoever. She was not a citizen of the world's smallest country. Her father did not work for the Pope. She had never walked the manicured paths of the Vatican gardens or sung in a papal choir. Mirella's family was working class, as Roman as the cobblestones. Her parents ran a bar, a small establishment on Via Volturno, not far from Termini, Rome's main train station. It was the kind of neighborhood where tourists rarely ventured, where the apartment buildings were crumbling and beautiful, where laundry hung from balconies and children played in the streets. She was attending a technical high school. She had dreams of her own, friends of her own, a life that seemed entirely ordinary. Nothing about Mirella. Gregori's existence suggested she would become tangled up in Vatican intrigue and international terrorism. And yet, on the afternoon of May 7th, Mirella received a phone call at home. The caller identified himself as Alessandro, the name of a former classmate from middle school, someone she knew and trusted. Would she like to come out and meet him? Just for a few minutes? "I'll be back in a little while," she told her mother. She walked out of the apartment, down to the bar her parents owned on the ground floor. She spoke briefly with her best friend, Sonia De Vito, the daughter of the bar's owner. They talked privately for about 10 minutes, locked in the bathroom. Then Mirella left the bar and walked out into the Roman afternoon. That was the last time anyone saw her. When investigators tracked down the real Alessandro, the classmate whose name had been used, he had an airtight alibi. He hadn't called Mirella. He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since they'd finished middle school together. Someone had impersonated him, used his name to lure her out of the safety of her home. The same tactic, using a false identity to gain trust, would appear again and again in cases of missing women throughout the 1980s. It suggested planning. It suggested someone who knew how to manipulate young women. It suggested a predator. The Gregori family received their share of strange phone calls in the weeks after Mirella's disappearance. But unlike the Orlandi case, there were no terrorist demands, no international organizations claiming responsibility. For 40 days, Mirella's case remained a local tragedy, the kind of disappearance that happened too often, that rarely made national news, that was mourned by family and friends, but forgotten by everyone else. Then came the Turkish communiques, linking the two cases in the public consciousness forever. The linking of the two disappearances prompted Italian President Sandro Pertini to make a public appeal for both girls' release in October 1983. It was an unprecedented step, the head of state personally addressing kidnappers on national television. Pertini was a revered figure, a former partisan who had fought the Nazis, a man whose moral authority was unimpeachable. If anyone could reach the kidnapper's conscience, surely it was him. But his appeal fell on deaf ears. No girls were released. No bodies were found. The telephone calls continued. The American and his cryptic demands, Turkish, and their threatening letters. But nothing changed. The negotiations went nowhere. The proof of life that investigators demanded was never provided. And then, in late October 1983, the American called Genaro Egidio with devastating news. Mirella Gregori was dead, he said. They had killed her. They would return her body 1 week before Christmas. When Egidio asked about Emanuela, the caller was curt. He had nothing to say about her. Not yet. Christmas came. No body was returned. The promise, if it could even be called that, had been empty, like everything else in this case. On December 24, 1983, exactly 6 months after Emanuela's disappearance, Pope John Paul II made a Christmas visit to the Orlandi family apartment inside the Vatican. What he told them was both reassuring and ominous. The case of Emanuela is a case of international terrorism, the Pope declared. The Holy See is doing as much as humanly possible to have a positive ending. Pietro Orlandi would later reflect on those words with bitter irony. From that moment, instead, the Pope allowed silence to surround Emanuela's case. The terrorism theory was convenient in some ways. It provided an explanation, albeit an incomplete one, for the kidnapping. It suggested that Emanuela was a pawn in a larger geopolitical game, caught up in Cold War machinations beyond anyone's control. But investigators would eventually conclude that the terrorism angle was almost certainly a misdirection. No evidence ever linked Turkish to any known organization. No proof emerged that either Emanuela or Mirella had ever been in the hands of international terrorists. The elaborate ransom demands, the careful leaking of personal details, the theatrical communiques, all of it appeared to be an elaborate smokescreen. The question was, covering for what? To understand what may have really happened to Emanuela Orlandi, you have to understand another death that occurred almost exactly 1 year before she disappeared. A death that would expose the Vatican's darkest financial secrets. On the morning of June the 18th, 1982, a postal clerk crossing London's Blackfriars Bridge noticed something hanging from the scaffolding beneath. It was the body of a man, suspended by an orange rope, tied in what was called a lover's knot. His pockets were stuffed with bricks and concrete, 11 pounds of masonry that would have weighed him down had he tried to swim. Despite the macabre staging, he still wore a luxury Patek Philippe watch and carried nearly 10,000 pounds in cash in various currencies. His name was Roberto Calvi, and he was known throughout Italy as God's banker. Calvi had been the chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, one of Italy's largest private banks and one of its most prestigious. Founded in 1896, the bank took its name from St. Ambrose, the patron saint of Milan. For decades, it had been considered the most Catholic of Italian banks, a financial institution whose very identity was intertwined with the Church. Under Calvi's leadership, that identity had become something darker. Calvi had risen through the ranks of Banco Ambrosiano during the 1970s, eventually becoming chairman in 1975. He was brilliant and ambitious, with a lightning-fast accountant's mind and a willingness to take risks that his more conservative colleagues found terrifying. He expanded the bank aggressively, forging connections with offshore financial networks, shell companies in Panama and Luxembourg, and the murky world of international finance, where legitimate business blurred into something else entirely. His most important relationship was with the Vatican Bank, officially known as the Institute for the Works of Religion, or IOR, under the leadership of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, an American prelate from Chicago who had been appointed by Pope Paul VI. The IOR had become deeply enmeshed in Banco Ambrosiano's operations. Hundreds of millions of dollars flowed between the two institutions in transactions that were, at best, ethically questionable. The Vatican Bank was using Banco Ambrosiano to move money secretly, bypassing Italian currency controls, evading regulatory oversight, channeling funds to destinations unknown. Some of that money, investigators later believed, was going to support the Solidarity movement in Pope John Paul II's native Poland, a covert campaign to undermine communist rule. Other funds were flowing in different directions, to Masonic lodges, to organized crime, to political factions throughout Italy and beyond. Calvi was also a member of Propaganda Due, or P2, an illegal Masonic lodge that operated as a kind of shadow government within Italy. P2's membership list, when it was eventually exposed, included 2 cabinet ministers, 48 members of parliament, the heads of all 3 Italian intelligence agencies, and hundreds of other powerful figures. The lodge was later accused of involvement in everything from political assassinations to the 1980 Bologna train station bombing. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, it left behind debts of up to $1.5 billion, one of the largest banking failures in history. The Vatican Bank was implicated as a major shareholder and had provided letters of credit for massive missing loans. Investigators would allege that Calvi had been laundering money for both the Italian mafia and P2, using the Vatican's good name as cover for transactions that were anything but holy. 5 days before his body was found in London, Calvi had written a desperate letter to Pope John Paul II. The collapse of the bank, he warned, would have the most profound impact on the Church and proved to be something of a financial catastrophe overall. The letter heavily implied that officials within both Ambrosiano and the Vatican knew exactly what had been happening and would be exposed if Calvi decided to talk. Calvi's death was initially ruled a suicide, but his family refused to accept that verdict, and subsequent investigations would reveal evidence strongly suggesting murder. His hands and fingernails were clean. Impossible if he had stuffed bricks in his own pockets and climbed rusty scaffolding. Damage patterns on his shoes were inconsistent with the suicide theory, and the symbolism of Blackfriars Bridge seemed too perfect to be coincidental. P2 members referred to themselves as Frati Neri, the Black Friars. In 2005, an Italian court concluded that Calvi had been murdered, likely by the mafia with possible Vatican involvement. The motive? He knew too much. He was prepared to talk. And in the world of organized crime and Vatican finance, that knowledge was a death sentence. The connection between Calvi's death and Emanuela's disappearance would not become clear for decades, but the timing was suggestive. Banco Ambrosiano collapsed in June 1982. Calvi was found dead later that month. Mirella Gregory disappeared in May 1983. Emanuela Orlandi vanished in June 1983. At the center of both the banking scandal and the subsequent kidnapping allegations was one figure, Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Marcinkus was an American prelate from Chicago who had risen through Vatican ranks to become the head of the Vatican Bank. He was tall, imposing, with a reputation as a fixer who could make problems disappear. Italian authorities issued an arrest warrant for him in connection with the Banco Ambrosiano collapse, but the Vatican's diplomatic immunity protected him from ever facing charges. Among those who lost money in the banking disaster was a Roman criminal organization called Banda della Magliana, the Magliana Gang. They had been laundering funds through Banco Ambrosiano's network, and when the bank went under, their investments vanished with it. According to one theory that would emerge years later, the gang kidnapped Emanuela Orlandi as leverage to force the Vatican to repay their losses. She was, in this telling, a hostage in a financial dispute between the Holy See and organized crime. But another, darker theory would suggest that Marcinkus himself had ordered the kidnapping, and that the reasons had nothing to do with money at all. For 22 years after Emanuela Orlandi disappeared, the case lay dormant. Investigators had pursued every lead, interviewed countless witnesses, followed up on hundreds of tips. Nothing had worked. The first official investigation was closed in 1997 without resolution, and Emanuela joined the ranks of Italy's most famous unsolved mysteries. Then, on July 11, 2005, an anonymous caller contacted the Italian television program Chi l'ha visto? Who has seen them? A long-running show dedicated to missing persons cases. The caller had a simple message. If investigators wanted to solve the Orlandi case, they should look into who was buried in the crypt of the Basilica di Sant'Apollinare. They should also investigate the favor that De Pedis did for Cardinal Poletti. It was the first mention of a name that would become central to the investigation, Enrico De Pedis. Enrico De Pedis, known as Renatino, roughly translated as Little Dollface because of his well-groomed appearance and handsome features, was one of the most notorious criminals in modern Roman history. He dressed impeccably, favoring expensive suits and designer sunglasses. He was charming, articulate, and utterly ruthless. As the leader of Banda della Magliana, he presided over an organization that had terrorized Rome since the late 1970s. The gang took its name from the working-class neighborhood where it had originated, Magliana, a residential area on the western outskirts of the capital, not far from Fiumicino Airport. What began as a loose confederation of local criminals had evolved into something far more sophisticated. Under De Pedis and other leaders, Banda della Magliana became a criminal empire. Drug trafficking, kidnapping for ransom, extortion, murder, and, perhaps most importantly, the laundering of billions of lire through legitimate businesses and financial institutions. The gang had connections everywhere: politicians, police officers, judges, intelligence agents. The Banda's reach extended into every level of Italian society. They were suspected of involvement in some of the most horrific crimes of the era. The 1978 kidnapping and murder of former Prime Minister Aldo Moro, the 1980 Bologna train station bombing that killed 85 people, countless other murders and disappearances that would never be solved. And they had a relationship with the Vatican. Through the labyrinthine channels of Italian finance, Banda della Magliana money had flowed into Banco Ambrosiano, and from there, according to some investigators, into the Vatican Bank itself. The gang had invested their criminal proceeds through Calvi's networks, trusting the church's financial arm to keep their money safe and growing. When Banco Ambrosiano collapsed, the Banda lost fortunes. They were, in a sense, creditors. Criminal creditors, to be sure, but creditors nonetheless. And they wanted their money back. De Pedis was killed in 1990, shot by two gunmen while riding his Vespa near the Campo dei Fiori, one of Rome's most beloved piazzas, where the statue of the heretic philosopher Giordano Bruno gazes eternally at the spot where he was burned at the stake in 1600. De Pedis's death was likely an internal gang matter, the settling of scores among criminals who had once been allies. His killers were never identified, but what shocked investigators wasn't how De Pedis died. It was where he was buried. Despite being one of Rome's most violent criminals, a man responsible for murders, kidnappings, and the corruption of an entire generation of Italian officials, De Pedis had been interred in the crypt of Sant'Apollinare, a prominent Roman basilica. This was an honor normally reserved for high-ranking clergy, cardinals, and major benefactors of the church. Popes had been buried with less ceremony than this gangster received. How had a mafia boss earned burial in sacred ground, literally steps from the music school where Emanuela Orlandi had taken her last flute lesson? The Basilica of Sant'Apollinare was operated by Opus Dei, the conservative Catholic organization known for its secrecy and influence. The crypt where De Pedis lay was the same basilica where Emanuela had attended her music classes. The coincidence seemed too perfect to be coincidental at all. The official explanation was that De Pedis had been a generous donor to the basilica's charity programs. He had given money to help the poor, they said. He had been a benefactor of the church. But the anonymous caller's mention of Cardinal Ugo Poletti, who had been the cardinal vicar of Rome at the time of De Pedis's death, suggested something more transactional, something darker. In 2012, the Italian Ministry of Interior confirmed that Poletti had personally approved De Pedis's unusual burial. The question was why? What favor had De Pedis done for the cardinal? What secret did his grave represent? The answers, such as they were, came from an unlikely source. Sabrina Minardi, De Pedis's former girlfriend. Minardi had been a young woman in the early 1980s, beautiful, reckless, and deeply entangled in Rome's criminal underworld. She had fallen in love with De Pedis, seduced by his charm and power, blind to or indifferent to the violence that funded his lifestyle. She had lived with him, traveled with him, been privy to aspects of his business that few outsiders ever witnessed. But Minardi was also a complicated witness. She had a history of drug abuse dating back to the 1980s. Cocaine, primarily, which she later admitted had clouded her memories and distorted her sense of time. She had been arrested and convicted on drug charges. She would later acknowledge that some of her recollections were confused, that details blurred together, that she couldn't always distinguish what she had witnessed from what she had heard secondhand. Her testimony shifted over time, with details changing between interviews. Italian prosecutors noted issues of incongruence, especially involving time periods, in her statements. The Vatican called her account baseless defamation. But some of what she claimed was verifiable, and all of it was explosive. According to Minardi, De Pedis had kidnapped Emanuela Orlandi on the orders of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the same Marcinkus who had run the Vatican Bank during the Banco Ambrosiano scandal. The same Marcinkus who had been protected by Vatican diplomatic immunity when Italian authorities tried to arrest him. The same Marcinkus who knew all the secrets of Vatican finance. Minardi's account was detailed and disturbing. On the night of June 22, 1983, the night Emanuela disappeared, Minardi claimed she and De Pedis were at a lake near Rome when one of his men arrived in a car. In the back seat was a teenage girl. matching Emanuela's description. Dark hair, frightened eyes, clearly not there by choice. De Pedis instructed Minardi to take the girl to her parents' vacation home in Torvaianica, a beach resort about an hour's drive south of Rome. The town was quiet, empty in the early summer before the tourist season began. Her parents' house was vacant. It would be a safe place to keep someone out of sight. For the next 10 days, Minardi said, Emanuela was held in that house. A woman named Adelaide, never further identified, was brought in to watch over her. The girl was drugged to keep her quiet and compliant. Minardi remembered hearing her moan and cry out in pain. She remembered the disturbing sounds coming from behind the locked bedroom door. After about 10 days, De Pedis gave new instructions. Minardi was to drive the girl to a Vatican-owned petrol station near St. Peter's Square. It was an innocuous meeting place, a spot where no one would think twice about two women getting out of a car. At the petrol station, Minardi claimed, a black Mercedes sedan was waiting. It had Vatican license plates. Behind the wheel was a man she described as dressed like a priest, though whether he actually was a priest, she couldn't say for certain. Minardi helped transfer the drugged teenager into the Mercedes. The man in priestly garb drove away. Emanuela Orlandi vanished into the Vatican's shadow. That was the last time Sabrina Minardi ever saw her. When asked why De Pedis had done this, Minardi recalled his answer. He had spoken dismissively, as if the question itself was naive. "It's all a game of power," he said. "Don't you get that?" Minardi's claims prompted investigators to reopen the Orlandi case in 2008. Her credibility was questioned. The Vatican called her account baseless defamation. But certain details checked out. De Pedis did own an apartment in Monteverde, the location Minardi mentioned. Investigators found a grotto beneath the building that could have been used to hold someone captive. 3 men Minardi identified as being involved in the kidnapping were confirmed members of De Pedis' organization. In May 2012, acting on the 2005 anonymous tip, Italian police opened De Pedis' tomb in Sant'Apollinare. The exhumation was conducted with full forensic protocols, investigators in white suits, cameras documenting every step, DNA samples carefully collected and cataloged. They found his remains, confirming that the tomb was indeed his final resting place. They found hundreds of other bones in nearby ossuaries, the accumulated remains of centuries of burials in the ancient basilica. Each bone was photographed, measured, and tested. None of them belonged to Emanuela Orlandi. The investigation confirmed that a traffic warden who had seen Emanuela speaking to the man in the green BMW on the day of her disappearance had later worked with police to create a composite sketch. That sketch bore a striking resemblance to Enrico De Pedis. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps another piece of a puzzle that refused to come together. But the investigation into the mafia connection raised more questions than it answered. Why would Marcinkus have ordered a Vatican teenager kidnapped? If it was about the banking scandal, about recovering lost money or silencing potential witnesses, why target a 15-year-old girl rather than someone directly involved in the financial disputes? And if Emanuela had been handed over to Vatican officials, as Minardi claimed, what had happened to her after that? The investigators found evidence that corroborated some of Minardi's claims. De Pedis did own an apartment in Monteverde, the neighborhood she had mentioned. Beneath the building, investigators discovered a grotto, an underground space that could have been used to hold someone captive. But there was no physical evidence, no forensic traces, nothing to prove that Emanuela had ever been there. 3 men, minority identified, as being involved in the kidnapping were confirmed members of DePatis's organization. Their names appeared in police files, their faces in mugshots. But by 2012, most were dead or in prison on other charges. The trail had gone cold decades ago, and still the questions remained. If Emanuela had been taken by the Banda della Maliana, why? If she had been handed over to someone at the Vatican, to whom? And what had become of her in the 40 years since? The answers, some believed, lay in the darkest allegation of all. In the Netflix documentary, Vatican Girl, released in 2022, a childhood friend of Emanuela Orlandi made a stunning claim. The friend, who chose to remain anonymous, said that in the week before she disappeared, Emanuela had confided something disturbing. She said that someone close to the Pope had been bothering her while she walked in the Vatican gardens. The friend interpreted this to mean that someone, possibly a cardinal or high-ranking cleric, had been making sexual advances toward Emanuela. If true, this would reframe the entire case. Emanuela's kidnapping might not have been about terrorism or banking scandals at all. It might have been about silencing a potential victim of clerical abuse or preventing a scandal that could have devastated the Church decades before the worldwide reckoning with predator priests. The documentary featured an interview with Father Gabriele Amorth, the Vatican's former chief exorcist, who died in 2016. Before his death, Amorth made explosive claims about what he believed had happened. This was a crime with a sexual motive, Amorth declared. Parties were organized with Vatican officials and diplomats, and girls were recruited for them. I believe Emanuela was one of their victims. Pietro Orlandi addressed this theory with characteristic bluntness. He acknowledged that Emanuela would never have told her parents if a cardinal had been inappropriate with her. It would have jeopardized their father's job and potentially forced the family to leave their Vatican apartment, their home for generations. But if she had been abused, and if her abuser had learned she might talk, the sexual abuse theory remains unproven. No direct evidence has emerged linking any specific Vatican official to misconduct with Emanuela. The anonymous friend's account, while disturbing, is based on a single conversation from over 40 years ago. But the theory gained circumstantial support from other developments in the case. In July 2023, the Vatican released a dossier to Italian prosecutors that raised questions about Emanuela's uncle, Mario Meneguzzi. According to the documents, Meneguzzi bore a resemblance to the composite sketch of the Avon man who had approached Emanuela on the day of her disappearance. The dossier also referenced a letter from Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, asking whether it was true that Emanuela's older sister Natalina had confided to a priest that their uncle had once molested her. Pietro Orlandi was furious at what he called a shameful attempt to shift blame onto his family. The uncle theory, he insisted, had been investigated and dismissed decades ago. Meanwhile, the real questions about Vatican involvement remained unanswered. Still, the sexual abuse theory offered an explanation for why the Vatican had been so determined to control the investigation, and why, after 40 years, they still seemed to be hiding something. In 2013, a man named Marco Accetti stepped forward and claimed to have been one of Emanuela's kidnappers. Accetti was already notorious. In December 1983, just 6 months after Emanuela disappeared, he had struck and killed a 12-year-old Uruguayan boy named José Garamón with his van on a country road 20 kilometers from the boy's home. The circumstances were suspicious. No one could explain how Jose had gotten so far from home unless he had been kidnapped. Acchetti maintained it was an accident, but questions lingered. Now, 3 decades later, Acchetti confessed to participating in both Emanuela's and Mirella Gregori's abductions. He claimed the kidnappings were part of an internal Vatican power struggle, blackmail between rival factions trying to influence Pope John Paul II's anti-communist policies. As proof, Acchetti produced a flute he claimed was Emanuela's. The Orlandi family believed it might be hers, but no DNA evidence confirmed it. One of Emanuela's music teachers said her instrument was a different model. Acchetti also claimed to have been the voice behind the mysterious phone calls, Mario and the American, who had tormented the Orlandi family in 1983. Voice analysis confirmed that he was indeed one of the callers to the Gregori family, lending some credibility to his claims. But Acchetti couldn't, or wouldn't, explain what had happened to either girl. He said he was arrested for Garaman's death before the operation was completed, and he didn't know their ultimate fate. Some investigators pursued a different theory entirely. Judge Otello Lupacchini and journalist Max Parisi conducted a study of young women who had been killed or gone missing in Rome between 1982 and 1990. They identified over a dozen victims with striking similarities. All young females, all lured away by deceptive job offers, all taken from public places without witnesses to any struggle. Their hypothesis was chilling. Both Emanuela Orlandi and Mirella Gregori might have been victims of an unknown serial killer operating in Rome during that period. The job offer Emanuela received, distributing Avon flyers, matched the pattern. So did the phone call Mirella received from a fake Alessandro, inviting her to meet up. Both girls had been manipulated into going somewhere with a stranger. Neither was ever seen again. If true, this theory would explain why the terrorist demands never went anywhere. They were cover stories, invented by someone with no political motive at all. The elaborate communiques from Turkish and the American might have been designed to mislead investigators and waste time while the real killer remained at large. But without bodies, without forensic evidence, without witnesses, this theory, like all the others, remained just that, a theory. In 2015, during the VatiLeaks scandal, an anonymous thief broke into a Vatican office and stole documents that would add yet another dimension to the mystery. Among the stolen papers was a document dated 1998, detailing expenses incurred for citizen Emanuela Orlandi between 1983 and 1997. The expenses covered food, medical care, accommodation, education fees, and travel, not in Vatican City, but in London, England. According to the document, Emanuela had been housed at a youth hostel for girls operated by the Scalabrinian Fathers, a Catholic congregation with close ties to the Vatican. The final expense, dated July 1997, was for general activities and transferred to Vatican City State with relative final paperwork. The implication seemed clear. Emanuela had been kept alive for 14 years in London, then returned to the Vatican after her death for burial on Vatican soil. The Vatican called the document a forgery. Italian investigators were skeptical as well. But for Pietro Orlandi and others who believed the Vatican was hiding the truth, the London dossier was proof that someone inside the Holy See knew exactly what had happened to his sister and had been covering it up for decades. The London theory connected to another strange element of the case, the repeated claims that Emanuela was still alive. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, various sources insisted Emanuela had survived her kidnapping. An anonymous caller, claiming to be a former intelligence agent, said she was being kept in a mental hospital in London. Mehmet Ali Aka, the Pope's would-be assassin, claimed from prison that she was living in a cloistered convent in Central Europe. A retired Italian judge suggested Emanuela had integrated into a Muslim community and spent years living in Paris. Another theory placed her under Vatican protection in an undisclosed location. None of these claims were ever verified, but they raised a disturbing possibility. What if Emanuela had been kidnapped not to be killed, but to be kept? What if she had been held as insurance, a permanent reminder of whatever secret her captors possessed? By 2025, Emanuela would be 57 years old. If she survived her ordeal, she would have spent most of her life in captivity or hiding. Her mother, Maria, still lives in the Vatican apartment, reportedly keeping a key in the door in case Emanuela ever comes home. In 2019, acting on an anonymous tip, the Vatican agreed to open 2 tombs in the Teutonic Cemetery, adjacent to St. Peter's Basilica. The tip had come in the form of a letter delivered to the Orlandi family's lawyer, accompanied by a photograph of a statue in the cemetery. The message was cryptic. "Look where the angel is pointing." The Teutonic Cemetery is one of the Vatican's most exclusive burial grounds, a small, ancient space reserved primarily for German-speaking Catholics with connections to the Holy See. Its gravestones date back centuries. Its atmosphere is one of hushed reverence, of history layered upon history. The tombs in question belonged to 2 19th-century princesses, Sophie of Hohenlohe-Waldenburg-Bartenstein and Charlotte Frederica of Mecklenburg-Schwerin. Both women had died more than a century before Emanuela was born. Their resting places should have contained exactly what one would expect: the preserved remains of German aristocrats, laid to rest in sacred ground by the faithful centuries ago. When investigators opened them, they expected to find either Emanuela's remains hidden among the princess's bones, or, at the very least, the intended occupants. Instead, they found nothing at all. The tombs were empty. The princess's remains had vanished, replaced by the mystery of how and when they had been removed. Who had opened these tombs before? Who had taken the bodies? And why? The Vatican expressed surprise. The Orlandi family expressed frustration. The investigation had generated more questions than answers. Again, investigators did find thousands of bone fragments in nearby ossuaries beneath the Teutonic College. Each fragment was collected and tested for DNA. Forensic anthropologists examined the pieces, trying to determine their age and origin. None belonged to Emanuela Orlandi. But the empty tombs added another layer of mystery to a case already drowning in them. The Vatican seemed incapable of keeping track of the bodies in its own cemeteries. If they couldn't account for 19th-century princesses, how could they be trusted to reveal what they knew about a missing teenager? More questions than answers, the Orlandi family's lawyer said. It had become the case's unofficial motto. The 2022 Netflix documentary, Vatican Girl: The Disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi, brought international attention back to the case like never before. Directed by Mark Lewis, the British filmmaker behind the acclaimed Don't Fuck Around with Cats, the 4-part series compiled decades of testimonies from witnesses, investigators, journalists, and family members into a compelling narrative that captivated audiences worldwide. The documentary was unflinching in its examination of every theory: the terrorist connection, the mafia involvement, the banking scandal, the sexual abuse allegations. It featured interviews with Sabrina Minardi, who restated her claims about De Pettis and the kidnapping. It showed Pietro Orlandi touring the family apartment, pointing out his sister's bedroom, preserved exactly as she had left it 40 years earlier. Her bed, her books, her dolls. The documentary also featured the anonymous childhood friend who claimed Emanuela had confided about being bothered by someone close to the Pope. This allegation, aired to millions of viewers, reinvigorated public interest and put pressure on both the Vatican and Italian authorities to act. But one notable absence underscored the documentary's central theme. No Vatican official appeared on camera. The Vatican declined to be interviewed for this series, read the final title card. That silence spoke volumes. For 40 years, the Vatican had refused to fully cooperate with investigations, had hidden behind diplomatic immunity, had offered promises of transparency while delivering only more questions. The Netflix documentary made that institutional silence visible to a global audience. Within months of the documentary's release, Pope Francis took unprecedented action. On January 9, 2023, exactly 40 years after Pope John Paul II had first publicly mentioned Emanuela's case, the Vatican announced it was opening its own internal investigation into her disappearance. Promoter of Justice Alessandro Didi was appointed to lead the probe. It was the first time since 1983 that the Vatican had officially acknowledged it might have information relevant to solving the case. "The case is open," Didi announced at a press conference. "We are conducting a complete review of all files, reports, and testimony. We will examine everything available in the structures of the Vatican and the Holy See." For the Orlandi family, the announcement was bittersweet. Pietro welcomed the investigation but remained skeptical. He had heard promises before. He had watched investigations open and close without resolution. He had learned, over 4 decades, that the Vatican moved at its own pace and according to its own priorities. "I hope this investigation is serious," he said cautiously. "I hope they share what they know. But I will believe it when I see results." The Italian government followed suit. In March 2023, the Chamber of Deputies unanimously approved a parliamentary commission to investigate both the Orlandi and Gregori disappearances. After delays, including controversy when Pietro Orlandi quoted allegations linking Pope John Paul II to a Vatican pedophile ring, the Senate approved the commission in November. For the first time, the 2 cases were being investigated simultaneously by 3 different bodies: the Vatican, the Rome Prosecutor's Office, and the Italian Parliament. Pietro Orlandi, who had spent his entire adult life searching for answers, allowed himself cautious optimism. "I've waited 40 years for the truth," he said. "This time, we have hope for a good result." In November 2024, the Vatican acknowledged the existence of a secret dossier on Emanuela Orlandi that had been rumored for years. "The file exists," Promoter of Justice Didi confirmed at a book presentation in Rome. "We found it." What the file contained remained confidential. But Didi said the Vatican continued to cooperate with Italian investigators and had forwarded relevant materials to Rome prosecutors. For Pietro Orlandi, the admission was vindication. For years, he had insisted the Vatican was hiding information. Now, finally, they had admitted he was right, but admission was not revelation. The contents of the dossier remained secret. The truth about what happened to Emanuela, whether she was kidnapped by terrorists, abducted by the mafia, silenced to protect a predator, or killed by an unknown serial killer, remained unknown. In June 2025, as this case entered its 42nd year, Italian investigators announced they had opened a criminal probe into Laura Casagrande, a childhood friend of Emanuela's, who may have been one of the last people to see her alive. Casagrande's revised testimony, prosecutors said, contained serious inconsistencies that might conceal crucial information. After 42 years, she still appeared reluctant to speak freely about what she knew. "Why is there so much fear so many years later?" asked the Orlandi family's lawyer. "You can tell she is being reticent. Is she covering for someone?" Pietro Orlandi holds regular sit-in protests near the Vatican, demanding answers. Each year, on June 22nd, the anniversary of his sister's disappearance, he organizes events calling for transparency. He has written books, appeared on countless television programs, and devoted his life to a single goal: finding out what happened to Emanuela. Their father, Ercole, died in 2004, without ever learning the truth. Their mother, Maria, remains in the Vatican apartment at 92 years old, the key still in the door. What happened to Emanuela Orlandi? After more than 4 decades of investigation, the honest answer is, we don't know. We know she left her apartment on a hot June afternoon in 1983 to attend a flute lesson. We know she called her sister to mention a strange job offer from a man in a green BMW. We know she was seen at a bus stop with friends and then vanished from the face of the earth. We know that in the hours and days that followed, her family searched desperately through the streets of Rome, calling her name into the darkness. We know that police were slow to respond, treating her disappearance as another runaway case, rather than the crime it almost certainly was. We know that someone, whether terrorists, mobsters, Vatican officials, or persons unknown, went to extraordinary lengths to obscure what happened to her. They made phone calls pretending to be kidnappers. They sent communiques filled with private details that only someone close to Emanuela could have known. They created organizations that may never have existed and made demands they never intended to see fulfilled. We know that the Vatican has information it has never shared. We know that at least one mafia figure claimed to have participated in her kidnapping and described handing her over to someone dressed as a priest. We know that bones have been found throughout Vatican City, that tombs have been opened, that investigations have been launched and closed and launched again, and we know that none of it has brought Emanuela home. The theories are many. Perhaps Emanuela was caught up in the aftermath of the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, a hostage in negotiations between the Vatican and the mafia over billions of lost dollars. Perhaps she was silenced to protect a sexual predator in the highest ranks of the church, her testimony too dangerous to be allowed into the light. Perhaps she was one victim among many of an unidentified serial killer who prowled Rome in the 1980s, luring young women with false job offers before making them disappear. Perhaps the truth is something we haven't yet imagined, something hidden so deeply in the Vatican's ancient archives that it may never emerge. What we know for certain is that the Vatican has the smallest police force in the world, protecting the smallest country in the world. And yet, for 40 years, it has been unable or unwilling to explain what happened to one of its own citizens. A girl who grew up within its walls, a girl who played in its gardens, a girl who sang in its choirs, a girl whose father served the Pope with distinction for decades. The Vatican has opened investigations and closed them. It has promised transparency and delivered silence. It has acknowledged the existence of secret dossiers while refusing to reveal their contents. And through it all, the Orlandi family has waited, year after year, decade after decade, for answers that never come. Pietro Orlandi is now in his 60s, older than his father was when Emanuela disappeared. He has gray hair and weary eyes and the stubborn determination of a man who will not stop searching until he finds the truth. He has written books, organized protests, appeared on countless television programs. He has been accused of exploiting his sister's memory and praised for his tireless advocacy. He has been dismissed by authorities and embraced by the public. And still, he searches. The Vatican must take a clear position, he has said. This is not just the disappearance of a girl. 42 years have passed in which facts have emerged that have never been made public, anomalies and responsibilities that have not yet been clarified. Somewhere in Rome, behind ancient walls that have guarded secrets for 2,000 years, the truth about Emanuela Orlandi may still exist, in documents not yet revealed, in memories not yet shared, in confessions waiting to be made, in the conscience of men and women who know what happened on that June evening in 1983 and have chosen to remain silent. Her mother, Maria, is now in her 90s. She still lives in the Vatican apartment where Emanuela grew up, where her room remains exactly as she left it. The bed made, the books arranged, the dolls waiting. According to family accounts, Maria keeps a key in the door, just in case. Just in case her daughter, after all these years, finally comes home. Until that day, if that day ever comes, Emanuela remains what she has been since June 22nd, 1983. A girl who left home and never came back. A daughter of the Vatican. A citizen of the smallest country on earth. A mystery wrapped in silence. And a question that refuses to be silenced.